Okay, it is now 1:45, and so I resume the hearing. Just before I pick up where I left off, I think 2 points to quickly cover with the Council in the first instance at least. So we were talking earlier about the need for an updated trajectory, both in relation to all housing and affordable housing as well. We're going to need to see what those look like. We've talked about it being slightly different because in some instances, housing is being put further back on some sites. But we are going to need to see those trajectories both with and without the Queen Elizabeth Barracks site. So that's the first thing, just to be clear about.
Can I just query on that one? With and without the Queen Elizabeth Barracks site for the trajectory. So the updated version that we submitted in phase 2 didn't have that in it. So you want to see that in it and the affordable housing? Yeah,
because to be absolutely clear, I don't want to go too far down this road, but those sites, 2 sites, isn't it, are in the plan as proposed by the Council. I know the Council has subsequently proposed to remove those sites, but we've yet to discuss that. So we're going to need to know what the picture is, both with and without.
Okay, understood. Thank you. Yes.
And the other thing is that I can share the happy news that I do now understand the policy as you've proposed to modify it, even without the able assistance of Mr. Griffiths. It has sunk in. I just wanted to be sure, in the table, this is table 5.4, where it says, well, you've got the brownfield and greenfield sites. So you've got an equal sign and a greater than sign. Is that meant to be greater or equal to? Is that what that's supposed to mean?
It is, yes. I think it could be perhaps better expressed in words. But it is, so it's 15 or more in essence.
Yeah, because otherwise it's clear that it's greater than 15. The equal thing just sort of, I couldn't work out. I kind of guessed, but it's perhaps not as effective as it could be, and maybe words would be better. Otherwise, you might have arguments about whether or not the figure of 15 is actually captured.
Yes, understood entirely. We really only sought modifications to the core bits, but take the point absolutely. We would hope that the clarity in 3, which says that on sites of 5 to 14, 2 above that, on sites of 15 and above, would help interpret that. But I think even with that, it's helpful just to be clearer.
Yes. Mrs. Jukes.
Thank you, sir. Just one point about policy H10. It's not clear as to whether it's been applied to net or gross numbers of dwellings. It's probably less of an issue now that the minimum number is 5. but I have had this on a practical basis where I asked the question to the council as to whether where I was proposing to demolish a house and make way for a new scheme, if the policy would apply because of that threshold, and I think that clarification is required, not least because the MPPF does actually talk about net gains under paragraph 152. Separately, mention of the gross internal areas in relation to clause, where is it? It's footnote 2, isn't it? Mention was made by the council that the gross internal areas is actually a question on the planning application form. It's not.
I was wrong. You're absolutely right, Mrs. Jukes. The area is, but not the gross internal.
The site area, but not the actual gross internal area. That is a question on the SIL form, but we don't have SIL yet in York. So it's just whether it's how the council actually manage that process. Also, criterion or consideration V, is that there? Where's it gone? I'm looking at the proposed modifications. Have we now referenced to... Oh, it's not changed, right. So, in the original policy, there's mention under point 5, or criterion 5, about pepper potting, and then pro-ratering of the total mix of housing numbers.
I'm really sorry, I couldn't hear you then, Mrs. Jukes. Could you say that again?
Sorry. So criterion 5 of policy H10, it refers to the size and types of homes should be a pro-rata mix of the total houses provided on site. That's not been my experience to date. It's all been down to negotiation with the council as to what they actually want. So I just asked the council whether that's actually still something they'd like in the policy, because it actually works against them in the conversations I've had about other, planning applications that are being considered at the moment. It's just there's no justification in policy as to why it needs to be prorated, especially if they're trying to actually address housing needs in the SHMA, because the SHMA doesn't necessarily work across into the character of a site, and then to prorata something that doesn't actually address the strategic housing market assessment, it just seems a little bit odd. Oh, and just one other point, the 1,000 square metres as well for the gross internal area, does that include outbuildings?
Yeah, I'm going to ask the council to come back on those detailed points before I move on.
Sir, could I just make the similar points before the council does?
Mr. Johnson, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I don't wish to interrupt on that, but I do agree on the point about pepper potting, and that in item 5 is that it's very difficult when you've got a site of 30% affordable housing to not have two affordable housing dwellings placed next to each other or more, in effect because of the way that clusters work in small parts of the development in delivering smaller affordable dwellings sometimes. So my preference is to get rid of the two or more affordable dwellings placed to one another. You'll still get a pepper potting. You can leave the pepper potting reference in, but we'll deal with that through design. But coming back to the point that Mr. Juicy just made about the pro rata, if I could just take you to table 1.1 of the document, the new housing needs assessment. It's in the executive summary, which is the CYC 92 document. Is table 1.1 provides you with a suggested mix for market housing, affordable housing in ownership and rented. And all of the mixes are different in the bedroom sizes and numbers, in effect. So the council's most up-to-date July 2022 document suggests that pro rata is not appropriate because that's not what the housing needs mix suggests. So if we are going to take reference to the most up-to-date material, is that the pro rata mix point should be removed as well, because that's not what the housing needs document actually tells us. Sorry, sir, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just thought I'd make that point to the evidence.
No, thank you for that. Ms. Bartle, is this for you?
I believe so, yes. So if we take the point on at the pepper potting principle, I think these were points that were echoed through some of the hearing statements, and we've considered those. And the council still is confident that the approach is sufficiently flexible and necessary to deliver the balance of homes on the site. And there's not been any evidence of it proving difficult to deliver in the way that the policy is phrased. So we would maintain council's position on that one.
Is pepper potting about achieving mixed communities? Is that the aim?
I would say it is in that sense. In that it is about making sure that sites are not.
You're trying to avoid affordable housing enclaves.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
How did you arrive at 2 affordable dwellings placed next to each other? No more than.
I believe that was in consultation with the RPs themselves and the way that they choose to look at sites. So it was taken on that basis, and accept the points that have been made that, and I think through some of the hearing statements around that some of the RPs do prefer to cluster their section of proportion of developments, but on balance of that consultation process, it was felt that the 2 was appropriate.
I dare say that we're likely to hear about having no more than 2 does start to make things difficult in management terms. That's certainly in hearing statements that I've read. I mean, really, I'm wondering about the justification for a rigid threshold in that part of the policy, and whether you could achieve your aim whilst being more flexible.
Yeah, I accept that, and we would seek to make sure that it was as flexible as possible. We could retain the objective in there, but perhaps consider a modification that takes out that prescribed relationship of 2 dwellings next to one another.
Reading it, it looks like you could achieve your end by finishing the sentence after development, so fully integrate the affordable housing by pepper potting throughout the development, and just leaving it at that.
I was reading the same and thinking we could do just that without harming that overall intention.
Do I take that as a main modification put forward by the council?
We would indeed put that forward, thank you.
On Mrs. Duke's question about gross internal area and it not being on the planning application form, presumably the council would just ask applicants to provide that figure, would you? Yes,
and perhaps an additional comment in the local checklist, I think it's referred to as, that makes that clear for those applications of residential developments.
And the question about whether or not the 1,000 square metres includes outbuildings.
we evidently, that hasn't been made clear in the explanatory text. We have not assumed that it does in terms of the testing that has been done. And we would perhaps need to just double check the evidence on that and confirm with you if that's sufficient.
For my part, I don't know what Mr. Griffiths thinks, but I suspect that some clarification in the policy would assist with effectiveness, because otherwise, just as a pragmatic point, you're likely to get arguments about it through planning applications, and you probably don't want that.
Agreed entirely, and I just wanted to double check that it hasn't impacted on any of the viability testing or anything. I don't believe that it would have done, but before committing to it, wanted to just be sure, but we would seek to change it to make it clearer.
I don't think we're trying to catch keen gardeners who've got large amounts of greenhouses in their back gardens.
I suppose the question could be about garages as well, detached garages.
Yeah, you've got
Annexes,
to be careful with those, of course, because they may be adding to the floor space of the dwelling. Yeah. And some people have a tendency to re-utilise garages despite planning conditions.
In which case, we'll give careful thought to the wording and the phrasing that we use to try and avoid.
We understand that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't know if you didn't have your microphone on there.
Sorry, we need just to make it clear that we're not seeking to include space that isn't properly part of the dwelling house. That is to say, exclude ancillary buildings and floor space.
I think Ms. Jukes had a query about the pro rata.
I was about to come on to that, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, we, to an extent, accept the point, and again, perhaps the phrasing is not particularly helpful or could be improved in this case. I think the council's position is that it would always seek to negotiate on sites, which indeed, as we've heard, is what happens. And the pro rata mix would be always, to some extent, a starting point, but that isn't necessarily clear in the way that the policy is phrased. And the point that was raised about how it reflects what that need actually is one that I accept. And perhaps here we should be looking to propose a modification that actually quite, well, there's perhaps a question of whether it's relevant to this part of the policy, and in fact, whether it's better suited to policy H3, which deals with mix that we'll talk about later. And I think that was expressed in one of the hearing statements, and I perhaps wouldn't argue with that necessarily.
Mr. Griffiths is going to be leading our session on housing mix later, and so I rather feel that I'm doing half of the work for him. But yeah, I mean, it's conceivable, isn't it, that the size and type of affordable homes that are needed might be quite a bit different potentially to those needed in the market housing part of the mix.
I agree, and the council certainly wouldn't want to prohibit the right mix coming forward through the fact that its own policy is slightly awkwardly worded in that respect.
In short, you think it's wrong?
Okay, yes. In which
Without
case,
wishing to put words into your mouth.
Yes. In which case, could we propose a modification that took that out of that policy and we reverted to policy H3 for the consideration of mix as appropriate on each site?
Okay, thank you for that. I think that covers off all of the points that were just covered. Mr. Johnson, are you indicating there?
Yes, sir, there was 2 points. I thought you might have missed the pro rata point, which I was going to come on to. And then finally, perhaps a point that's not been mentioned is the actual targets within the policy. And I wasn't sure as to whether or not there's going to be a conversation about the targets, but if there is, it was just putting a marker down as to the 30% on the greenfield sites, which we don't object to, but any suggestion that it could be higher has to be in the basis of the discussion that was had on viability, which was in session 2. And with respect to that, it's not just simply looking at affordable housing as a target on its own. It really has to be taken in the round, having regard to other Section 106 expectations, infrastructure requirements, and the move towards a lower carbon construction. And in which case, all of those have been tested, and we think that the 30% is appropriate. And whilst no doubt you could make a push for it to be higher, I think you also have to realise that the 30% based upon the current transfer value rates is quite a task. And on that basis, I don't think there is a justification for trying to make it higher without having a knock-on effect on something else in the plan. For example, if you went for a higher target, can you achieve the carbon savings? Can you provide the infrastructure payments for the schools and the highways? So it's just a marker if that debate was about to open up.
I think you've just opened it, Mr. Johnson.
I think that I wasn't aware we were making that point. I mean, it may be a let's have more market housing rather than increase the percentage argument, but we've dealt with that, and viability is always an issue when you're considering affordable housing. So it's not a closed door. I mean, it's about as wide open as it can be. It's part of viability testing at the development management stage.
Yeah, the policy includes a viability clause, doesn't it? I wasn't clear, Mr. Johnson. Were you seeking a change there, or was it a matter of, I think you said actually putting a marker down, didn't you?
It was putting a marker down, so I'm not seeking a change. There was reference made before from participants and from the council is that maybe we could achieve more affordable housing from these sites than the target, say in this particular case 30%. What I'm saying is that for now the evidence doesn't suggest that we should be amending these targets. We shouldn't be amending the policy.
Was that the reference earlier, Mr. Johnson, to headroom?
No, I think, sir, the reference to headroom before is the fact that the council thinks it's over-allocated, and I think the reference to headroom means you can perhaps get more affordable housing from the collection of sites and dwellings from the plan as a whole, and I think that's the reference to headroom. I don't think there's headroom in the individual sites to provide more affordable on each of those individual sites than what's already currently estimated in the policy.
I don't think this is a point anybody else is making. I think Mr. Johnson's worrying unnecessarily.
To be fair, sir, I think we're about to find somebody who may just be about to make that point.
I think Councillor Pavlovich made the point about raising the...
And I'd like to make it again, if that's okay, when I get the opportunity.
Yeah, there'll be no need for that. I do have the point noted from earlier, so I understand why, in response to that's being mentioned.
But could I just...
I'll say it's not a point we're making.
Councillor Pavlovich.
Thank you, but could I just check with Mr. Johnson, who says viability in York wouldn't support more than 30% on greenfield, but there are other authorities in this area that have higher percentages. So are they asking for something lesser than York is asking for? Why would York be some sort of exception, given the actual market prices of the house? Why is viability such an impact for York and not for Craven, for example? I mean, I don't live and breathe, and I don't have the breadth of knowledge of different local plans, but that's, you know, we spent a lot of time talking just now about small sites, which, as Mr. Johnson said, will equate on a 10 dwelling site would equate to one affordable house, when we're actually missing the elephant in the room that says, can any plan that's planning to deliver 36% of the affordable need, or even potentially 50% of the affordable need, be positively prepared? You know, what about the other 50%? What about the other 64%? You know, these are human beings and their lives and their families and household formation and all the rest of those things that, you know, we can lose sight of if we just take a really dry analysis. And I don't think even 50% is a sufficient aspiration to meet the need. So that's why I feel that the thresholds need to be reconsidered. But there you go. Maybe I'm just a bit simplistic in my approach.
Mr. Keogh.
Thank you, sir. I was going to make this point at the end, maybe in relation to GB4, but it's come up now, so I'll make it. My understanding of the references earlier to headroom mentioned by the council were as per Mr. Johnson's interpretation, that I thought the council were looking to increase, or see how they could increase the delivery of affordable housing by, for example, amending the percentage requirements within the policy. And on that point, I would just make a few observations, and also in light of what Councillor Pavlovich has just said. I think that tinkering with the percentages in policy H10 is only going to lead to a best marginal contribution to affordable housing. I think many of the papers presented to you today have demonstrated the frankly dire situation with respect to affordable housing delivery. It's simply not being delivered. And looking forward, the really significant contributions to come from strategic sites are being pushed back into the latter end of the plan period. The other point to bear in mind is that the affordable housing percentages have been in the plan now, draft plan, for best part of 5 years at least, maybe longer. And of course, many of the strategic sites that you're looking at, and I'm no doubt this will come up when you look at when you consider the sites individually in coming sessions, they've obviously been brought forward, and the schemes have been worked up on the basis of the percentages in that policy. So if you start amending those percentages, I think that involves a reappraisal of many of those strategic sites in terms of what they can deliver in terms of infrastructure and other Section 106 contributions. So it just leads to further complications in the process overall. But as I said, I think looking to start to adjust the percentages at this stage would at best deliver a marginal increase. And I come back to the point I made earlier, which is in our view that the only real way to significantly increase the delivery of affordable housing is to look at sites that can deliver and that undertake to deliver early on in the plan, well, what's left of the plan period. Sites that can deliver more than the council is asking, as we have set out, and sites that are backed up by companies such as we're proposing Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust that could actually help and almost guarantee in that delivery. And I think that's what you need to be looking at, rather than as I say, this tinkering at the edges, frankly, in terms of thresholds for whether or not schemes of 5 units should be subject to affordable housing requirements or off-site contributions. I mean, this is really tinkering at the edges in terms of delivery of affordable housing, given the scale of the problem this city, this council faces.
Mr. Lane.
Quick point, sir. Just to go back, point of clarification that was made by the council in response to Mr. Johnson. The council said they've got to reflect in their policy government guidance, but doesn't government guidance say contributions should not be sought for developments of 10 units or less and which have a maximum combined area. And I'm just confused about the council's policy. Perhaps they can help me out there.
I've explained this now several times. I'm not going to explain it again. The policy is there to be read.
In short, see if I get this right now.
Can we mark you out of 10?
In short, the council says that the way that the main modification has been drafted is consistent with the PPG because, in effect, it relies on the use of the gross internal area square metre figure when it comes to dwellings, where it comes to sites where the number of dwellings are less than 10.
Thank you for the clarification, sir. I'm not entirely sure I agree that that's the appropriate response, but that's for you, sir.
Thank you for that, Mr. Lane. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, sir. I think the council are wrong on that one, but I'm not going to go back to it. I think if you were looking for an alternative solution, you drop the 1,000 square metres and go for a site area threshold for the minimum number of 5 dwellings and capture it that way. But also, just to come back on Councillor Pavlovich's point about viability and why it's different in other districts, I'm not going to labour this point, but yes, it is higher in some other districts, but the Section 106 requirement is significantly less than what it is in York. So in effect, those developments are contributing in other districts a lot less towards highways and education, and as a result of that, they deliver more on affordable housing. And in some of those cases, the transfer values are higher than what they are in York. So it's just about priorities. But ultimately, it's a viability exercise where you take one from the other. But ultimately, the development is still contributing equally to the social purse in effect. But I'm happy to have that conversation outside.
Mr. Merritt.
Yes, I'd like to support Councillor Pavlovich's point about the main strategic site thresholds and disagree with Mr. Keir. Whilst arguing about the small sites, I would agree is relatively marginal. If you actually to increase the percentages on the larger strategic sites, it will make a quite sizable improvement potentially in the number of affordable. If you go back to the evidence base for the original plan, which was Hearn's 2016 report, that report said at the time, based on 2012 to 2014 data, that 25 to 40% affordable housing would be achievable. And we have had, as I think we're all aware, a massive escalation in house prices and land prices since then, which we believe would certainly permit a substantial increase in the affordable housing percentages on existing sites. And I certainly think that is worth doing without necessarily detracting from Mr. Keogh's point about the benefit of having additional sites as well in order to meet our suggestion of a higher overall housing figure. And that would certainly help to increase the amount of affordable. The other issue is, of course, in terms of the size of some of those strategic sites and the reduction. Clearly, if you reduce the size of sites, it makes it more difficult to achieve all the Section 106 asks. And I certainly accept Mr. Johnson's point that you do have to look at the whole picture in the round. So if we want to maximise the affordable housing, actually restoring some of those sites to the original allocations should actually help to contribute to achieving higher affordable housing provision as well. And clearly that will have to be dealt with on a site-by-site basis as the policy allows in terms of any exceptions where it's difficult to deliver the full set of targets. But Councillor Pavlovich referred to Craven. Harrogate is, both Craven and Harrogate have 40% affordable housing targets. Cambridge has 40%, Oxford has 50%. So the York Council's 20 to 30 is a very low figure for an authority in housing stress. So we certainly do believe there is scope for upping the main greenfield and brownfield targets.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the council answered the point that Mrs. Jukes raised earlier about net or gross.
Apologies if we didn't. The council's position is that it would be a net figure, but we should make that clear in the policy too, presumably. Offer that as part of an additional modification.
So is that a proposed main modification to add the word net?
Oh. In which case, please ignore what I just said. Okay. In which case we'll go with gross on the basis that the PPG advises us to do so. Or requires us to do so.
So the NPPF actually advises net. Paragraph 152. 2012. The whole point is that if it applies to gross, then if you demolish a house and you put back the same number, then actually you lose one. So you're actually asking for more than what you might have started with. It should apply to net. 152. It talks about net gains across economic, environment, and social dimensions of sustainable development.
Housing, it's dealing with sustainability of local plans. It's not dealing specifically with affordable housing, because the 1,000 gross internal was introduced by written ministerial statement after 2012, but within the context of the NPPF as it then stood, and the PPG followed suit. So you wouldn't expect to see it in the NPPF. And those provisions are simply not dealing with that issue.
But sir, this local plan should accord with the NPPF in the 2012. So if that talks about net provisions, then I'd have thought that it would follow that this policy should reflect that sentiment in paragraph 152.
The NPPF is not dealing with net floor space in terms of affordable housing. But the PPG is explaining how the Secretary of State expects the 2012 NPPF to be interpreted. And it's part of the suite of policies that go with the NPPF.
Okay, thank you for that. I just take it that you're not going to agree and you'll leave it to us. Okay, I'm going to move then to issue 1.6. Is the approach to off-site financial contributions a reasonable one?
The Council's position is that it is, and I'd like to invite Mr Marshall to talk through the calculation as it's expressed in the policy.
Sorry, sir, give me a second. Yeah, just to alert you back to the document you received this morning. The way we've calculated that method is it's in the proposed modification schedule at within the policy at number 3, which is the average York property price minus the average York fixed RP price times by an affordable housing percentage to get the OSFC. Those contributions we've actually set out in our table 2 of that report. So that's that calculation, which I think might have answered a question earlier in the discussion. That's the figure that has been used to populate the results in table 3, in particular the viability headroom that it's showing. And as we mentioned before, the percentage requirements of affordable housing kind of fit with what the council has suggested, leading us to conclude it is a viable policy that wouldn't unduly harm the deliverability of homes.
So, in short, it's reasonable because it's viable?
Yes.
Mr. Merritt? Mrs. Jukes?
Sorry, my card was left up from last time, but I've just been having a look. The council's housing requirements are actually based on a net housing need. So surely the affordable housing requirement should also be net rather than gross.
I'm afraid Mrs. Jukes is confusing issues. The question is not net in terms of floor space. That's a different net.
Sorry, I think we're talking cross purposes. The threshold is 5. It was 2, it's now 5. And that's the point at which the net and the gross is to be applied that I'm talking about. Because are we talking about it applies at a net of however many additional dwellings, or is it on the gross number of dwellings referred to in the policy? That it's nothing to do with the floor space.
Is Mr. Jukes talking about the exercise which has already been undertaken, which was to net off the resales?
No. Correct me if I've got this wrong, Mrs. Jukes. Mrs. Jukes is saying, well, she's pointing at the first part of the policy that says to help maximise affordability across the housing market, the council will support residential schemes for 5 or more dwellings, which, and the question there is whether that's 5 or more net or 5 or more gross. For example, where the development might involve a demolition or something.
I think it's gross because we've already netted off in terms of affordable housing need replacements, and it seems to me that there's no justification if you decide to build 5 new dwellings, even if you're demolishing an old one, you should still look at the affordable housing provision. Because it's the development, not the fact that you're choosing to create something more intrinsically more valuable by knocking down what's already there.
So if we look at SIL, and if we look at any other kind of financial contribution, it always refers to net. So something like SIL, you only pay SIL on the net additional floor space because you take off what's already there. It's the same principle in terms of applying the affordable housing policy, in that it should refer to net again. If we look at other local authorities, they always refer to net. And if I could find it, it's somewhere in government guidance as well. I just haven't managed to lay my finger on it.
Well, the SIL regime is based, as we all know, on a whole series of complex calculations and assumptions. And that is a separate regime and a separate series of rules from those applicable here. And there's a vacant building credit provision within the policy, which is on the top of page 117, second paragraph down. And it will depend on the circumstances as to whether the credit applies.
So just on this point of SIL, it might be separate, but actually the principles as to whether it applies are the same, because the same tests apply to SIL as apply to planning obligations, which includes affordable housing. So the SIL applies in both scenarios.
I'm afraid we're not going to agree. I can't really add any more.
Okay, thank you. Anything else in relation to issue 1.6? Mr. Johnson.
Yes, thank you, sir. It's just a brief point, and I referenced it in my statement, is in effect, are we applying the off-site contribution to the self-build elements within the strategic sites? I don't want to make this sound too complicated, but in effect, when you bring forward a strategic site with a detailed application in various phases, we can see that there'll be elements of the self-build area, in effect, left behind for the self-build purpose or custom-build purpose. I'm not quite sure as to what the expectation is from the self-build requirement, because we're assuming that if a self-build comes forward under a custom-build, let's say a cluster of 10, is that they may be caught with this particular off-site contribution policy, because the policy as it stands is that, well, it's not as clear as what it could be under the self-build requirement.
All development, because otherwise, to paraphrase what was said earlier, it would be easy to start dodging the application of the policy by including self-build elements. If a self-build element raises viability issues, then self-evidently it'll be a matter to be picked up at the development management stage and any viability considerations.
I think I understand the response here, but I think that would be if a self-build comes forward on a strategic site, as those plots will individually come forward, if they come forward as individual single dwelling applications, which you would expect under self-build, is that they would be just coming in as single dwelling application, therefore there would be no contribution towards affordable housing because they are a single dwelling.
It's entirely not what I said.
In which case, I don't see how the mechanism is provided for within the policy to provide anything different?
If there is an attempt at avoidance of the policy, it may be the council has to say, before you can self-build, you're going to have to master plan, or we're going to look at the gross total for the site, and you will pay an appropriate contribution having regard to that. Otherwise, the earlier point that was made that, well, it's easy to avoid the application, it runs a coach and horses through the policy, and that can't be what's intended. And if that's seriously what's being suggested by developers, then we will have to keep an eye on what happens.
I'll take it up with the case officers and policy officers separately, so just to make sure that there is... I can see how there is a potential for a bit of a vacuum within the policies to how it's meant to apply.
On a strategic site, for example, would the application not be made first of all in outline for X number of dwellings, and then you'd apply 30% affordable housing requirement to that X number, and then when the self-build plot came forward, it would be more likely to come forward as reserve matters, because a part of the site on the outline would be given over to self-build. Am I misunderstanding that?
It's a little bit of a new area, this, because yes, if an outline is granted approval, and let's say it's 30% in the section 106, and each phase of the development comes forward, each phase provides 30%, and that you've got a cell area which is the self-build area, which will be service plots. All of the other areas are brought forward by the major house builders in different phases, and they're all providing 30% within that individual phase. When you get to the self-build phase, because it's not the house builder that's building those within that phase, how does that phase of self-build deliver on affordable housing? It's built into the section 106 in the outline that it will provide 30%, but there's individually, those planning applications come forward at reserve matter stage as separate individual detailed planning applications, and therefore it's that gap as to where does that 30% within the affordable zone actually come about, because it's not factored into the rest of the scheme, because the rest of the scheme in each individual phase is doing 30% affordable housing in accordance with the policy. It's just how do you deliver affordable housing in self-build on a strategic site?
Well, surely the answer is, as you said, Mr. Griffiths, a strategic site will require an outline permission. The 30% will be imposed, or whatever percentage it is that meets viability. And it'll be a matter for the site owners to ensure that the self-build phase within reserve matters makes its contribution, or that they make the contribution themselves and sell the self-build without that requirement. That's a detailed matter for contracts for landowners, and the obvious way around it, as you've said, is the outline permission, which is what I was suggesting earlier. I mean, it's unrealistic to expect the strategic sites being brought forward bit by bit, except as phases of a broader outline or master plan.
Was there anything else? Okay, thank you.
Anything else on issue 1.6?
Can I just ask a question, if I may? I just wanted to be very clear about what average York fixed RP price means.
It's a figure of £94,000. It was. Apologies, we should have put this in the report. It's a cost from the registered providers. It used to be £75,000 that we've used in CD018. That's been kind of uprated for the latest viability report. Equally, the average York price has been increased as well. Yeah.
That's helpful. As long as I know, that's fine.
Issue 1.7 then, and policy GB4. Will alternative sources of supply through policy GP4 make any material difference in terms of supply?
We've recognised in our hearing statement that it's not going to lead to swathes of affordable housing coming forward. We wouldn't anticipate it as such, but it felt like an appropriate policy response to have something in there that enabled those sites to come forward in the right circumstances. We haven't at this stage offered any reflection on the wording of the policy or modifications, simply because we felt it was going to be dealt with in phase 4. So really, in principle terms, that aspect is considered appropriate. We acknowledge that it's unlikely to deliver high numbers of affordable housing, but it's sensible to include in this case.
I think there was a reference to a figure this morning, wasn't there, of 12 over a period? I can't remember the period.
I think that's in the council's affordable housing note. Again, we haven't updated. Well, we've looked at it. We haven't published an updated version of that. I think that was through Windfalls, perhaps. But I wouldn't anticipate it being much different to that.
So of that order? Sort of.
Indeed, of that order, yes.
I don't want to go into the detail of the wording of this policy today because, as Ms Bartle rightly anticipates, we will pick that up in phase 4. With that in mind, is there anything on this? Mr Keogh?
Yes, so just one point. If you're going to pick the wording up in phase 4, then I'll leave any comments until then, because I think the policy as it's worded is very restrictive and discouraging of schemes coming forward. And I think that's why there has been such my evidence or information is that there's been no delivery under this policy thus far. I may be wrong, but the council refer to a figure of 12 in their affordable housing note. So thus far, we'd agree that the policy will make no material difference. And I think it just goes back to the heart of the issues that we were discussing earlier. Just to finish on 2 points, I'm sure you're relieved, my final points, just to reiterate. Firstly, on the issue of flexibility, and this point, this policy touches on this issue of flexibility. How can we increase affordable housing delivery or make a meaningful contribution to an increase in affordable housing delivery? In areas, council areas, which are not affected by Greenbelt, it's quite relatively simple because sites are brought forward on non-allocated sites, and there are several recent appeal decisions. I was just reading about one in North Somerset last week, where a site was brought forward on the basis that the council could not demonstrate a 5-year land supply. No Greenbelt issues. Upon adoption of this plan, as we've heard today, there's no safeguarded land at the moment included. There's no white land. So upon adoption, everything that is not either an allocated site or within the urban area is Greenbelt. The flexibility, therefore, to address the issues we've been discussing this morning is extremely limited. And this is the time now within this process for you to incorporate flexibility into the plan through, for example, an uplift in the housing requirement, as we've discussed earlier. So I just reinforce that point. And this goes to the heart, really, of many of the issues, and maybe the heart of the local plan process itself, which is all about certainty. So when you're looking, sir, at what measures you can take to provide as much certainty as possible to increasing delivery of affordable housing, we would look at, we just invite you to look at the suggestions that we've made in our submissions. So certainty and flexibility are just two key components of this plan that are missing at the moment.
Anything else on issue 1.7?
Can I just advance one thought? Given we've had a number of suggestions that some may seek to avoid the affordability provisions, I think we may need to give some consideration to another main modification, which will allow the council to take, in the case of larger sites, a holistic view of its capacity for affordable housing in the event that it is proposed to be delivered in numbers that might otherwise fall below the affordable housing threshold, in order to make sure that an anti-avoidance approach will be taken. So we'll take that away and have a think about it. It's not, as Mr. Henderson reminds me, it's not an uncommon sort of provision.
Okay, anything else then on matter 1 before we move on?
Right, well, I'm doing matter 10, so I'm going to suggest perhaps the best thing we can do is have a break before we get on to that. I've got just after 2:45, if I can rely on my watch, which I can't always. Yes, so let's resume at 3 o'clock. Okay, until then, thanks everyone.